The call that changes everything. The phone rang at 5:47 a.m., cutting through Jake Harrison's restless sleep like a blade through silence. 23 years as a park ranger, and he still felt his gut clench at pre-dawn calls. Nothing good ever happened before sunrise. Jake, you need to get out to Heartland Ranch. Now. Deputy Clay Mitchell's voice carried the weight of something terrible. It's hell. I don't even know how to describe it. Jake was already reaching for his boots. What have we got? Bull attack. Python. Jesus. Jake, you ain't gonna believe this. The words hit him like ice water. Python. In East Texas. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. Lord have mercy. Sometimes the good Lord tests us in ways we can't fathom. How long ago? 18 hours. The big male's been standing guard over the female the whole time. Won't eat, won't drink, won't move. Jake. Clay's voice cracked. He's dying of grief, and she's barely breathing. Transport trucks coming at dawn tomorrow to separate them. 24 hours. Jake's hands trembled as he grabbed his keys. In 24 hours, whatever bond was keeping those animals alive would be severed forever. I'm 10 minutes out. The line went dead, leaving Jake with the terrible certainty that he was racing against more than time. He was racing against heartbreak itself. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The ranch at dawn. The gravel crunched under Jake's tires as he pulled into Heartland Ranch, the headlights cutting through the Texas darkness. At 82, Jedediah Jed Hawthorne still rose before dawn, but today he stood hunched by the pasture fence like a man who'd aged a decade overnight. The ranch that had been in his family for 4 generations stretched out before them, rolling hills dotted with live oaks and mesquite. But all eyes were fixed on the small paddock near the barn. There, in the golden wash of floodlights, stood the most heartbreaking sight Jake had ever witnessed. Beauregard, all 2,000 pounds of him, positioned himself like a fortress around the motionless form of Savannah. The massive Brahman bull's gray hide was streaked with dried blood, his distinctive hump rising and falling with labored breaths. But it was his eyes that stopped Jake cold, dark, intelligent, and filled with a pain so human it made his chest ache. 18 hours, whispered Buck Thompson, the old ranch hand who'd worked this land longer than anyone could remember. At 75, Buck had seen everything the Texas countryside could throw at a man, but his weathered hands shook as he gripped the fence rail. Ain't moved except to chase off the medics. Won't let nobody near her. Dr. Magnolia Sue Caldwell knelt 20 feet away, her veterinary bag open beside her, medical supplies scattered on the ground where Bo had scattered them with one warning charge. She was a practical woman, spent 30 years treating ranch animals, but tears streaked her cheeks as she watched the vigil. She's got internal bleeding, she said, without taking her eyes off Savannah. Broken ribs, puncture wounds. That python damn near killed her before Bo drove it off. Jed's voice came out as barely a whisper. Eleanor always said them two had something special, more than just breeding pair. His late wife had been gone 6 months now, and the grief still lived in every line of his face. Said they understood each other in ways that put most married folks to shame. Jake studied the scene, his ranger's mind cataloging details while his heart broke a little more with each of Beau's ragged breaths. The bull hadn't just been standing guard, he'd positioned himself to shield Savannah from every angle, his massive body a living wall between her and the world. "Transport's coming tomorrow at dawn," Deputy Clay said, arriving with coffee that nobody wanted. "State Agriculture Department says they gotta be separated. Different facilities, regulations." "In all my born days," Buck muttered, "ain't never seen nothing like it. That bull's got more sense about love than most folks I know," as if hearing them. Beau turned his great head toward the humans gathered at the fence. His eyes held a plea that needed no translation. "Don't take her from me. I can't lose her too." The countdown had begun. 3 years ago, when love found a way, Jake leaned against the fence rail, watching Beau's unwavering vigil, and felt the years collapse around him. The sight of that devoted bull triggered a memory so vivid it made his chest tighten, not of cattle, but of his own Martha, lying in that sterile hospital bed while he held her hand and refused to leave her side. "You know," Jed said softly, his weathered hands gripping the fence. "Them two weren't always like this. Time was. Old Beau there wouldn't look twice at another cow." The memory unfolded like an old photograph coming into focus. 3 years ago, when Eleanor Hawthorne was still alive, and the ranch hummed with the contentment of a family operation in its prime. Jake remembered that spring morning when the cattle transport had rumbled up the drive, carrying a young heifer who would change everything. The truck's air brakes hissed as it came to a stop near the loading chute. Eleanor emerged from the farmhouse, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron, excitement dancing in her eyes like a young girl's. At 79, she still moved with the grace of someone who'd spent her life working alongside the animals she loved. "Come see, Jed," she called to her husband. "Come see what Buck found at the auction." Jake had been there that day, conducting a routine inspection of the ranch's wildlife crossing permits. He'd watched from the porch as the transport gate swung open and revealed the most beautiful Brahman heifer he'd ever seen. Her coat was the color of morning mist, gray and white swirled together like watercolors bleeding into each other. But it was her eyes that caught everyone's attention, intelligent, alert, and holding just a touch of wariness at finding herself in a new place. "Savannah," Eleanor whispered, the name coming to her as naturally as breathing. "Look at those eyes. Jed, she's got the soul of a Southern belle." Buck Thompson guided the heifer down the ramp with the gentle patience of a man who'd been handling cattle for 50 years. "Found her at the Brazos County sale," he explained, his voice soft so as not to spook her. "Owner passed on. Family didn't want the responsibility. But you can see she's been loved. Mrs. Hawthorne. Look how she carries herself." And she did carry herself differently. Where most cattle moved with the simple purpose of finding food and comfort, Savannah walked with an almost regal bearing, her head held high, taking in her new surroundings with careful consideration. That's when they heard a sound that raised every head on the ranch. From the far pasture came a deep, mournful bellow that seemed to echo from the very soul of something broken. Beauregard. "He's been like that since we lost Daisy," Jed explained to Jake, his voice heavy with concern. "That tornado 2 months back. She was the only cow that didn't make it to shelter in time. Found her the next morning, and Beau ain't been the same since." Jake remembered how the sound had chilled him then, that raw grief pouring out across the morning air. Bo had been magnificent, even in his sorrow, nearly 7 feet tall at the shoulder, his hump pronounced and powerful, his horn spreading wide like a crown. But grief had hollowed him out, left him standing alone in whatever pasture they put him in, calling for a mate who would never answer. "Ain't natural," one of the younger ranch hands had muttered. "It's just a cow. He'll get over it." Eleanor had turned on him with fire in her ancient eyes. "You watch your tongue, boy. Love is love, no matter what package it comes in. That bull's heart is breaking, and anybody with eyes can see it." The old woman had been right. Of course. Over the following weeks, Jake had watched the slow dance of healing begin. At first, Bo had ignored the new arrival completely, continuing his solitary wandering through the ranch's 1,000 acres. But Savannah, with the patience of someone who understood loss, had simply begun to graze wherever he was. She never approached directly, never forced her presence on him. She simply existed in his orbit, a gentle, constant reminder that the world still held beauty worth noticing. When he moved to a new pasture, she would somehow end up in the adjacent field. When he stood beneath the old oak tree that had become his refuge, she would position herself just within sight, content to let him know he wasn't alone. The breakthrough had come on a Tuesday morning in late May. Jake had been checking fence lines when he spotted them across the valley, Bo and Savannah, grazing side by side for the first time. Not close enough to touch, but close enough to share the same patch of sweet grass beneath the cottonwoods. Eleanor had wept when Buck told her about it over coffee that afternoon. "She's teaching him how to live again," the old woman had whispered. "Lord knows we all need someone to show us the way back from grief." But it hadn't been simple or quick. Jake remembered the setbacks, the mornings when Bo would retreat into isolation again, the way Savannah would wait patiently at whatever distance he needed. There had been the day when storms rolled through and Bo had finally allowed her to shelter beside him beneath the barn's overhang. The morning when Jake had spotted them drinking from the same stock tank, their massive heads lowered in perfect synchronization. It's like watching a courtship. Eleanor had marveled one evening as they all stood watching the pair from the porch. But more than that, it's like watching two souls recognize each other. The ranch hands had started to talk. Of course, some of the older men grumbled about unnatural attachment and worried that Bo's devotion to Savannah might make him less effective as a breeding bull. There had been heated discussions around the dinner table about whether it was wise to let cattle form such intense bonds. "Ain't good for business," argued Tom Rickman, the ranch's former foreman. "Bull gets too attached to one cow. He won't do his job with the rest of the herd. We should separate them. Let him spread his attention around." Eleanor had slammed her coffee cup down so hard it cracked the saucer. "Thomas Rickman, I've known you since you were knee-high to a grasshopper, and I never took you for a fool until just now. You look at them animals and tell me what you see ain't worth protecting." Jake had seen it too, the way their bond deepened through that first summer. They developed their own language, a series of low rumbles and gentle touches that spoke of comfort and understanding. When the heat grew oppressive, they would seek shade together, Bo positioning his bulk to give Savannah the best protection from the sun. When coyotes yipped in the distance at night, he would move closer, not possessive but protective. The moment that convinced everyone had come during the roundup that fall. The ranch hands were working to separate the cattle for health checks, and in the chaos. Savannah had been accidentally driven into the wrong pen. Beau's bellow of distress had shattered the autumn air, and before anyone could react, he'd charged the fence, not in rage, but in desperate need to reach her. "I ain't never seen nothing like it," Buck had told Eleanor later, his voice full of wonder. "That bull would have gone through a brick wall to get to her, and when we opened the gate, soon as he reached her, he just settled, like finding her was all he needed in the world." Eleanor had defended their bond fiercely after that, silencing any talk of separation with the kind of moral authority that only comes from a lifetime of watching love in all its forms. She'd seen marriages fail and marriages flourish, had buried children and celebrated grandchildren, and she recognized something sacred when she witnessed it. "Y'all talking about breaking them up for business reasons," she'd said during one particularly heated discussion. "But what kind of business breaks apart something beautiful just because it don't fit in a neat little box? This ranch been in our family for 4 generations because we understood that love, all kinds of love, makes everything stronger." Jake pulled himself back to the present, watching Beau maintain his vigil over the injured Savannah. The bull hadn't moved in 18 hours, hadn't eaten or drunk water, seemed to be willing his own life force into keeping her alive. It was the same desperate devotion Jake had felt during Martha's final weeks, the same refusal to accept that love might not be enough to conquer everything. But there had been signs, hadn't there? Looking back, Jake could see the foreshadowing that none of them had wanted to acknowledge: the increased snake sightings around the ranch over the past month, the way some of the newer ranch hands had grumbled about Beau and Savannah's bond, calling it unnatural and problematic, the tension that had begun building after Eleanor's death, when practical concerns started outweighing the old woman's romantic notions. And there had been other things. 2 whispers about exotic animals being smuggled through the area, rumors of underground markets for dangerous pets. Jake had filed reports about non-native species sightings, but bureaucracy moved slowly, and by the time anyone took action, it might already be too late. Now, watching Beau's desperate vigil, Jake understood with crystal clarity what they were really fighting for. This wasn't just about saving 2 cattle, it was about preserving something precious in a world that seemed increasingly determined to reduce love to mere biology, to dismiss devotion as anthropomorphic projection. Eleanor always said they understood each other, Jed murmured, echoing Jake's thoughts. Said they had something most married folks spend their whole lives trying to find. The old rancher's words hung in the morning air like a prayer, while 20 feet away, Beauregard continued his watch, proving that some loves truly are worth dying for. The truth emerges. At 8:00 a.m. sharp, the first of many vehicles began arriving at Heartland Ranch. Jake watched through the morning haze as Deputy Clay Mitchell's cruiser pulled up alongside a white van marked Texas Department of Agriculture, followed by a livestock transport truck that made his stomach clench with dread. 22 hours left on the countdown, and the bureaucrats were already circling like vultures. Dr. Maggie Sue Caldwell stood up from her vigil beside her medical bag, dust and grass stains marking her usually pristine veterinary coat. She'd been trying to get close enough to properly examine Savannah for the better part of 3 hours, but Beau's protective instincts hadn't dimmed despite his exhaustion. Every time she approached, he would lower his massive head and take a threatening step forward, not to attack, but to make his boundaries crystal clear. "This is impossible," she muttered, pulling off her latex gloves in frustration. "I can't properly assess her condition with him standing guard like some kind of sentinel. For all I know, she could be hemorrhaging internally while we waste time trying to figure out how to get past her bodyguard." The transport team leader, a thin man named Morrison with the kind of officious bearing that came from years of following regulations without question, stepped out of his truck and surveyed the scene with obvious distaste. He consulted his clipboard with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd separated countless bonded animals before. "Standard protocol is clear," Morrison announced to the gathering crowd. "Injured animal goes to the veterinary facility in Houston. Healthy animal returns to regular ranch operations. No exceptions, no matter what kind of attachment they might have formed." Jake felt his jaw clench. "That bull hasn't eaten or drunk water in 18 hours. You call that healthy?" Morrison's smile was thin and bureaucratic. "Emotional distress isn't a medical condition. Ranger Harrison, it's anthropomorphism projecting human feelings onto livestock. These animals will adapt once they're separated. They always do." "The hell they will," Buck Thompson growled from his position at the fence. The old ranch hand had positioned himself between the transport truck and the paddock, his weathered hands gripping a pitchfork with the kind of determination that suggested he wasn't moving for anyone. "You ain't been watching what I've been watching. That bull would rather die than leave her side." The argument was interrupted by the arrival of another vehicle, a sheriff's department SUV that disgorged Deputy Clay Mitchell and, to everyone's surprise, a man Jake recognized as Dr. Robert Henley from the State Wildlife Department. Henley's presence immediately shifted the dynamic. Wildlife officials didn't show up for routine livestock transport. "Gentlemen," Dr. Henley said, approaching the group with the careful neutrality of someone delivering bad news, "we need to talk. This situation is more complicated than a simple cattle injury." Jake's ranger instincts kicked into high gear. "How much more complicated?" "The python that attacked your cattle wasn't an escaped pet," Henley said, pulling out a tablet and scrolling through what looked like incident reports. "We've had 3 similar attacks in the past month, all in a 50-mile radius, all involving large constrictors that have no business being in East Texas. We're dealing with intentional releases." The words hit the assembled group like a physical blow. Jed Hawthorne's face went pale, his age showing more clearly than Jake had ever seen it. "Intentional? You mean someone's been turning them snakes loose on purpose?" "We believe so. The pattern suggests someone with knowledge of ranch operations and cattle behavior. The attacks have been specifically targeting valuable breeding stock." Dr. Henley's expression was grim. "This wasn't random. Mr. Hawthorne, your ranch was deliberately targeted." Dr. Maggie Sue's medical bag slipped from her suddenly nerveless fingers. "Sweet Jesus, you're telling us someone tried to murder Savannah. I'm telling you that someone has been using exotic constrictors as weapons, and your cattle were victims of what amounts to biological terrorism." The revelation hung in the morning air like smoke from a distant fire. Jake felt his worldview shifting, the simple story of a python attack transforming into something far more sinister. His mind raced through the implications. If the attacks were deliberate, then whoever was responsible might strike again. And if they were targeting Heartland Ranch specifically, then Bo and Savannah might still be in danger. Morrison, the transport official, seized on the new information with obvious relief. "Well, that settles it," If there's an ongoing investigation, these animals need to be moved to secure facilities immediately. We can't risk another attack." "The hell you will," Jed said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that comes from owning land for 60 years. "This is my ranch, and them's my cattle. If someone's targeting us, then separating them bulls ain't gonna solve nothing. It's just gonna break their hearts while we wait for the next attack." Jake watched the bureaucratic wheels turning behind Morrison's eyes. The man was clearly calculating liability, insurance coverage, and regulatory compliance while completely ignoring the emotional devastation he was about to inflict. It was the kind of cold practicality that had always made Jake's skin crawl the reduction of living, feeling creatures to mere entries in a ledger book. "Mr. Hawthorne," Morrison said with practiced patience, "I understand your attachment to these animals, but regulations exist for good reasons. Keeping them together in an unsecured location puts them at continued risk. The female needs immediate medical attention, and the male needs to be removed from the stress of this situation." "Stress," Buck's voice cracked like a whip. "Boy, you don't know the first thing about stress. You want to see stress. Try separating them two, and watch what happens to both of them." As if summoned by their conversation, Bo lifted his massive head and turned toward the humans gathered at the fence. His dark eyes, rimmed with exhaustion, seemed to take in every face, every uniform, every piece of equipment that represented a threat to his vigil. Then he lowered his head again and gently nuzzled Savannah's neck, a gesture so tender it made several of the watching men look away. Maggie Sue knelt down and began repacking her medical supplies with sharp, angry movements. "This is medical malpractice," she muttered. "I've got a patient who needs surgery, and I can't properly treat her because her husband won't let me near her. And now you're telling me that if I do manage to save her life, you're going to drag them apart anyway." "It's not personal, Doctor," Morrison replied. "It's policy." "Policy," Jake repeated, the word tasting bitter in his mouth. He thought about Martha's final days, how the hospital had tried to enforce visiting hours while she was dying, how he'd had to fight just to stay by her side. "You know what, Morrison? Sometimes policy is just another word for cowardice. Sometimes it's an excuse to avoid making the hard choice, the right choice." The internal monologue that had been building in Jake's mind all morning finally crystallized into clear understanding. This wasn't about regulations or safety protocols or even the ongoing investigation into the Python attacks. This was about whether love, real, devoted, sacrificial love, had any value in a world increasingly dominated by spreadsheets and liability assessments. He remembered the promise he'd made to Martha during her final weeks. "I won't leave you. Whatever happens, I won't leave you alone." He'd kept that promise, sitting beside her hospital bed for 72 straight hours while she slipped away, holding her hand and whispering reassurances that probably meant more to him than to her. The hospital staff had called him devoted. His friends had called him obsessive. His daughter had worried that he was destroying his own health in a futile gesture. But Jake knew better. Love wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic declarations. It was about showing up, day after day, hour after hour, especially when showing up was the hardest thing in the world to do. It was about refusing to abandon someone when they needed you most, even if that someone was a 2,000-pound Brahmin bull who couldn't speak your language but understood your heart perfectly. "How long do we have?" Jake asked quietly. Dr. Henley checked his watch. Transport is scheduled for dawn tomorrow. That gives us about 22 hours to complete our investigation and make arrangements for the animal's safety. And if we refuse transport? Morrison's expression hardened. Then the state can invoke emergency protocols and remove the animals by force. Mr. Hawthorne could face fines, legal action, and loss of his livestock operating license. Jed's shoulders sagged under the weight of bureaucratic threats, but his voice remained steady. Son, I buried my wife 6 months ago. Lost the love of my life after 53 years of marriage. You think I'm scared of some paper-pushing threats when I'm watching the same kind of love story play out right in front of me? The old rancher's words carried across the morning air like a benediction. Buck nodded approvingly, while Dr. Maggie Sue wiped tears from her eyes with the back of her hand. Even Deputy Clay seemed moved, his official bearing softening as he watched Bo's continued vigil. 22 hours, Jake repeated, his mind already working through possibilities. That's not much time to solve a biological terrorism case and save 2 broken hearts. It'll have to be enough, Dr. Henley said. Because after that, the decision gets taken out of all our hands. As if sensing the gravity of the conversation happening nearby, Bo raised his head again and looked directly at Jake. Their eyes met across 20 feet of Texas dirt and grass. And in that moment, Jake understood with perfect clarity what the bull was asking of him. Don't let them take her. Don't let them break what we have. Fight for us the way you fought for her. The countdown continued, but Jake Harrison was done watching from the sidelines. Some fights were worth losing your job over. Some loves were worth defending against the entire weight of bureaucratic indifference. The war for Beauregard and Savannah's hearts was about to begin. The enemy has a face. At 11:00 a.m., just as the morning heat was beginning to shimmer off the metal roof of the barn, Deputy Clay Mitchell's radio crackled to life with the kind of static-filled urgency that made everyone freeze. Jake watched the deputy's face change as he listened to the transmission, his expression shifting from professional attention to something much darker. "Copy that," Clay said into his radio. "We're en route." He looked up at the gathered group, his jaw tight with barely controlled anger. "We got him. The son of a bitch who's been releasing the pythons. Vernon Slade, age 42, currently barricaded in a trailer house about 10 miles from here." The name hit Jed Hawthorne like a physical blow. The old rancher staggered backward, one weathered hand reaching for the fence post to steady himself. "Vernon, but we..." His voice trailed off as the implications sank in. "You know this man?" Dr. Henley asked, already pulling out his tablet to take notes. Buck Thompson spat into the dirt, his face twisted with disgust. "Know him, hell. We fired his sorry ass 3 months ago. Caught him mistreating the stock, using cattle prods when he thought nobody was watching. Jed gave him more chances than he deserved, but Vernon never could learn that animals deserve respect." Jake felt his blood turn to ice water as the pieces began falling into place. This wasn't random. He was targeting your ranch specifically. "Revenge," Jed whispered, his voice barely audible. "Sweet Jesus, this is all my fault. I fired him, and he went after my cattle to get back at me. Doctor..." Maggie Sue looked up from her position near Savannah, her face pale with horror. You're telling me that bull has been standing guard over his mate for 18 hours because some vindictive bastard wanted to hurt her as payback for losing his job? The revelation hit everyone like a slap. Morrison, the transport official, suddenly looked uncomfortable with his clipboard and regulations. Even the state agriculture officials seemed shaken by the realization that they were dealing with deliberate cruelty rather than a random accident. "There's more," Clay continued, his voice grim. "When we searched his trailer, we found evidence of a whole network. This isn't just one disgruntled employee. Vernon's been working with exotic animal smugglers out of Louisiana. They've been using pythons and other constrictors as weapons for hire." Buck's weathered hands clenched into fists. Weapons for hire. What kind of sick bastard turns snakes into murder weapons? The kind that charges $50,000 to destroy a rancher's prize breeding stock and make it look like an accident, Dr. Henley said, scrolling through information on his tablet. Insurance fraud, revenge hits, eliminating competition. We're tracking at least a dozen cases across 3 states. Jake felt sick. The image of Savannah trapped beneath that massive python, fighting for her life while Bo charged to her rescue, took on a new and horrifying dimension. This hadn't been nature's cruelty. It had been human malice, calculated and cold-blooded. "How many more are out there?" he asked. "How many more pythons did Vernon release?" Clay's expression darkened further. "That's the problem. We think he let loose at least 6 over the past month. We've only accounted for 3, the one that attacked Savannah, one that was killed by a farmer near Nacogdoches, and one that was captured by animal control in Tyler. The other 3 are still out there." The implications hit everyone simultaneously. Jed sank down onto an overturned feed bucket, suddenly looking every one of his 82 years. My God. Other ranches. Other families. How many more animals is that monster gonna hurt? Dr. Maggie Sue stood up abruptly, her professional composure cracking. "This changes everything. We're not just treating an injured cow, we're treating a victim of attempted murder. And that bull isn't just grief-stricken, he's traumatized. He watched someone try to kill his mate." Jake's mind raced through the psychological implications. Bo's behavior wasn't just devotion. It was the desperate vigilance of someone who'd witnessed an attack and refused to let his guard down again. The bull was suffering from something that in humans would be called post-traumatic stress disorder. "No wonder he won't let anyone near her," Jake murmured. In his mind, strangers are threats. We represent danger. Morrison cleared his throat, his bureaucratic composure wavering. This does complicate the situation. If these animals are victims of a crime, there might be legal implications to consider." "Legal implications?" Buck's voice rose to a roar. "Boy, the only legal implication you need to worry about is what I'm going to do to you if you try to separate them bulls after what they've been through." The arrival of another vehicle, a news van from the local television station, added a new dimension to the crisis. Within minutes, a reporter and cameraman were setting up near the fence, drawn by the story of the devoted bull who wouldn't leave his injured mate's side. Jake watched with growing unease as the human drama began to overshadow the animal tragedy. "This is exactly what we don't need," Dr. Henley muttered. "Media attention, public opinion, pressure from animal rights groups. This investigation is about to become a circus." But Jake found himself thinking about Martha again. about those final weeks when well-meaning friends and family had tried to convince him to take a break from his bedside vigil. They'd used words like unhealthy and obsessive, never understanding that leaving her side would have been a betrayal of everything their marriage had meant. Looking at Beau, still standing guard despite his obvious exhaustion, Jake recognized the same desperate love that had kept him glued to Martha's hospital bed, the same refusal to accept that sometimes love wasn't enough to conquer everything, combined with the absolute determination to prove that it was worth trying anyway. "We're not separating them," Jake announced suddenly, his voice cutting through the various conversations and arguments. "I don't care about regulations or liability or bureaucratic convenience. Those animals have been through hell, and we're not adding to their trauma by ripping them apart." Morrison's expression hardened. "Ranger Harrison, you don't have the authority to make that decision. State regulations are clear." "State regulations don't account for biological terrorism," Jake shot back. "These aren't normal circumstances, and they don't call for normal solutions." Dr. Maggie Sue nodded emphatically. "He's right. Separating trauma victims is contraindicated in every medical manual I've ever read. These animals need each other for psychological healing as much as physical recovery. The insurance company won't cover treatment if protocols aren't followed," Morrison warned. Jed struggled to his feet, his grief transforming into something harder and more determined. "Son, I don't give a damn about insurance companies. That bull saved my cow's life, and now somebody needs to save his. If that means I mortgage the ranch to pay for veterinary bills, so be it." The news reporter, sensing a compelling human interest angle, approached the fence with her microphone. "Mr. Hawthorne, can you tell our viewers about the bond between these two animals?" "Ma'am," Jed said, his voice steadying as he found his footing in familiar territory. "What you're looking at there ain't just two cows. That's a love story. That bull would die before he'd abandon his mate. And if we're going to call ourselves civilized human beings, we got an obligation to respect that kind of devotion." Jake watched the camera capture Beau's continued vigil, the bull's massive frame swaying slightly with exhaustion, but his position unwavering. The image was already powerful. But knowing the full context, the deliberate cruelty that had created this situation, the calculated evil that had tried to destroy something beautiful, made it almost unbearable. 20 hours, he said quietly, checking his watch. 20 hours to solve this mess and find a way to keep them together. Deputy Clay was already heading back to his cruiser. "I'm going to the scene where they arrested Vernon. Maybe we can get more information about the other pythons. Find out if there are more attacks planned." Dr. Henley followed. "I'll coordinate with state wildlife officers. If there are 3 more constrictors out there, other ranches are in danger." As the officials departed, leaving the core group of ranch family and friends around the fence, Jake felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. This wasn't just about saving 2 cattle anymore. It was about proving that love and loyalty still mattered in a world that seemed increasingly determined to reduce everything to dollars and liability assessments. "Buck," he said, "how long can Beau keep this up without food or water?" The old ranch hand studied the bull with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent his life reading animal behavior. "Not much longer. Maybe another day. Maybe less. That bull's running on pure stubbornness and love right now. But even the strongest heart's got limits." Maggie Sue knelt beside her medical bag, her mind clearly working through possibilities. If I could just get close enough to properly examine Savannah, set up an IV line, maybe give her some pain medication. But he won't let me within 10 feet. What if we could earn his trust? Jake asked. What if instead of trying to work around him, we found a way to work with him? The question hung in the morning air as the countdown continued, each passing minute bringing them closer to a forced separation that would destroy two hearts that had already endured far too much. But in Jake's mind, a plan was beginning to form, a plan that honored both the love he was witnessing and the promise he'd made to Martha all those years ago. Some fights were worth everything you had to give. Some loves deserved heroes. The heart of the storm, at 2:00 p.m., with only 5 precious hours remaining before the transport deadline. Jake found himself standing in the ranch house kitchen, staring at a photograph that made his chest tighten with recognition. Eleanor Hawthorne smiled back at him from the silver frame, her arm wrapped around Jed's waist as they stood beside the very paddock where Bo now maintained his desperate vigil. "That was taken 3 years ago," Jed said softly. Appearing in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee, neither of them really wanted. Day after Savannah arrived, Eleanor was so excited about that heifer. Said she had good bones and a gentle soul. Jake accepted the coffee, his hands wrapping around the warm ceramic as fragments of memory began assembling into a fuller picture. He remembered Eleanor Hawthorne as a woman who'd possessed an almost mystical understanding of the animals on her ranch, the kind of intuitive connection that came from spending 79 years watching creatures love and grieve and hope. The memory rose unbidden Eleanor in her hospital bed just 6 months ago, her once robust frame diminished by the cancer that would claim her within weeks. Jake had visited during her final days, ostensibly to discuss ranch permits, but really to pay his respects to a woman who'd become something of a legend in the county. "Jake, honey," she'd whispered, her voice barely stronger than a breeze through autumn leaves. "You promised me something. When I'm gone, you keep an eye on them bulls. Bo and Savannah, they got something special. Don't let nobody break it apart just because they don't understand." At the time, he'd nodded and made soothing promises, thinking she was talking about ordinary cattle management. Now, watching through the kitchen window as Bo swayed with exhaustion but refused to abandon his post, Jake understood that Eleanor had seen this crisis coming with the kind of clarity that only approaches death can provide. "She knew," Jake murmured. "Somehow, your wife knew this day would come." Jed followed his gaze to the window, where the afternoon heat shimmers made the tragic tableau in the paddock look like something from a fever dream. Eleanor always said love leaves marks on the world. Said you could feel it in places where it had been strong, like an echo that never quite fades away. The philosophical moment was interrupted by the arrival of vehicles, not the official ones they'd been dreading, but pickup trucks and SUVs driven by neighbors who'd heard the news. Jake watched through the kitchen window as the Hendersons climbed out of their Ford, followed by the Martinez family. Old Pete Sullivan with his arthritic hands but determined expression, and at least a dozen other ranching families from across the county. They came bearing casserole dishes and thermoses of coffee, folding chairs in grim determination. Word had spread through the tight-knit rural community with the speed that only comes when neighbors recognize a fundamental threat to their way of life. This wasn't just about Heartland Ranch anymore. It was about whether love and loyalty still counted for anything in a world increasingly dominated by bureaucratic indifference. "Lord have mercy," Buck Thompson said, appearing in the kitchen doorway with wonder in his voice. "Half the county's showing up. Haven't seen anything like this since the Henderson barn fire back in '98. Jake stepped out onto the porch and felt his throat tighten at the sight. These were people who worked from sunup to sundown, who measured their days in concrete accomplishments and practical results. But they dropped everything to stand witness to something that transcended the mundane concerns of daily ranch life. Maria Santos, the young wildlife biologist Jake had worked with on conservation projects, approached the porch with a determined expression. "Jake, I've been making calls. There are legal precedents for keeping bonded animals together during medical treatment. The Americans with Disabilities Act has provisions that could apply here. These aren't service animals." "Maria," Jake replied, though he appreciated the effort. "No, but they're victims of a crime, and there's established case law about psychological trauma in animals. If we can document that separation would cause additional harm." She trailed off, clearly grasping at legal straws but unwilling to give up. Dr. Maggie Sue emerged from the paddock area, her face streaked with tears of frustration. "I've been trying for an hour to get close enough to properly examine Savannah. Every time I approach, Bo positions himself between us. He's not being aggressive, he's being protective. But I can't treat her properly from 20 feet away." The flashback hit Jake without warning Martha's oncology ward, where he'd spent countless hours watching medical professionals work around his presence beside her bed. There had been the night when her blood pressure had crashed, machines beeping frantically while nurses tried to maneuver around his chair. He'd been in the way, medically speaking, but Martha's vitals had stabilized the moment he'd taken her hand. "Sometimes," the night nurse had said quietly, "the best medicine isn't something we can prescribe." "What if we stopped fighting it?" Jake said suddenly, the idea crystallizing as he spoke. "What if instead of trying to separate them or work around Bo, we found a way to include him in Savannah's treatment?" Dr. Maggie Sue looked skeptical. "Include a 2,000-pound bull in delicate veterinary procedures. Jake, that's not just dangerous, it's impossible." "Is it?" Jake pressed. "You said yourself he's not being aggressive. He's being protective. What if we could convince him that we're trying to help, not hurt?" Buck Thompson had been listening from the porch, his weathered face thoughtful. "Might work," he said slowly. "Bo's always been the smartest bull on the ranch. Hell, he's smarter than half the people I know. If we could show him we're on his side." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Pastor Samuel Reynolds, whose presence added an unexpected spiritual dimension to the gathering. At 60, Sam had been providing comfort to ranching families for 30 years, and his appearance signaled that the community recognized this as more than a medical crisis. "Jed," Pastor Sam said, embracing the old rancher with the familiarity of decades of friendship, "Eleanor would be proud of what you're doing here, standing up for love, refusing to let bureaucrats break apart something sacred." Another memory surfaced Eleanor's funeral 6 months ago, when Pastor Sam had spoken about the different forms love could take. "The good book tells us that perfect love casts out fear," he'd said. And I've watched Eleanor demonstrate that truth every day of her life. She loved her husband, her land, and every creature on it with the kind of fearless devotion that makes the world a better place. Jake found himself thinking about the theological implications of what they were witnessing. If love was indeed the fundamental force that Pastor Sam preached about, then Bo's devotion to Savannah represented something approaching the divine, a pure, selfless commitment that asked for nothing in return except the chance to keep giving. "Pastor," Jake said, In your experience, is there a meaningful difference between human love and what we're seeing in that paddock? Sam's eyes crinkled with the kind of wisdom that comes from a lifetime of counseling grieving families and celebrating joyous unions. Son, I've seen marriages where the partners would abandon each other at the first sign of trouble. And I've seen animals display the kind of loyalty that puts most humans to shame. Love is love, whether it's got 2 legs or 4. The crowd around the fence had grown to nearly 50 people, creating an impromptu vigil that transformed the ranch into something resembling a pilgrimage site. Jake watched families who normally spent their Sundays at church services now standing in respectful silence around a paddock, bearing witness to a love story that touched something primal in the human heart. The parallel to Martha's final days became inescapable. Jake remembered the visiting hours when their small hospital room had filled with friends and family, creating a community of support around their private tragedy. There had been something sacred about those moments, when individual grief became collective witness, when personal loss transformed into shared understanding of what love could endure. 4 hours, Doctor, Maggie Sue said quietly, checking her watch. 4 hours before they try to force separation. Jed looked around at the faces surrounding his ranch neighbors who'd driven miles to stand with him. Friends who'd risked their own schedules to support his fight. Strangers who'd been touched by a story that transcended the boundaries of species and circumstance. "You know what," the old rancher said, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "I don't care if it costs me everything I own. I don't care if the state takes my license and the insurance company refuses to pay. That bull in there saved my cow's life, and now it's our turn to save his." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, the kind of collective commitment that rural communities could summon when fundamental values were threatened. These were people who understood that some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds were stacked against success. Buck Thompson stepped forward, his arthritis forgotten in the heat of moral clarity. "Count me in, Jed. Been working this ranch for 40 years, and I ain't about to watch some government bureaucrats tear apart the most beautiful thing I ever witnessed." "Doctor." Maggie Sue wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, professional composure giving way to human emotion. "If we're really going to do this, if we're going to fight for them, then we need a plan. Medical protocols, legal strategies, public relations, the whole 9 yards. Jake felt the weight of leadership settling on his shoulders, the same sensation he'd experienced during Martha's illness when difficult decisions couldn't be avoided or postponed. Sometimes love required more than good intentions. It demanded action, sacrifice, and the willingness to stand up against systems that prioritized efficiency over humanity. "Then let's make a plan," he said, his voice carrying across the crowd with the authority of someone who'd decided that some battles were worth losing everything to fight. "Let's save these animals and prove that love still matters in this world." The countdown continued, but the war for Beauregard and Savannah's hearts had found its army. When heaven and hell collide at 5:00 p.m., with only 2 hours remaining until the transport deadline, the portable surgical tent that Dr. Maggie Sue had hastily erected beside the paddock looked like something from a battlefield medical unit. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across equipment that represented Jake's last desperate gamble performing emergency surgery on Savannah, while allowing Beau to remain close enough to provide the psychological comfort that might mean the difference between life and death. "This is insane, Doctor," Maggie Sue muttered for the 100th time, her hands trembling slightly as she prepared the anesthesia equipment. "I've never attempted major surgery with a 2,000-pound bull as an assistant. If something goes wrong, if he panics, he won't panic," Jake said with more confidence than he felt. For the past hour, he'd been working with Bo, speaking in the low, gentle tones that seemed to calm the exhausted animal. Somehow, impossibly, the bull had begun to trust him not completely, but enough to allow Jake to approach Savannah with medical supplies. The crowd of neighbors and supporters had formed a respectful perimeter around the makeshift surgical area, their faces reflecting the collective tension of a community that had invested its hopes in an outcome that defied every conventional wisdom about livestock management. Pastor Sam moved among them, offering quiet prayers and words of comfort, his presence transforming the medical crisis into something approaching a religious vigil. Buck Thompson stood closest to the surgical tent, his weathered hands gripping the fence rail with white-knuckled intensity. 47 years I've been working with cattle," he whispered to no one in particular. "And I ain't never seen nothing like this. That bull knows we're trying to help. Look at his eyes, he knows." Jake did look, and what he saw made his chest tighten with recognition. Bo's dark eyes held the same desperate hope that Jake remembered from Martha's hospital room, the same willingness to trust medical professionals despite every instinct screaming that strangers represented danger. It was the look of someone who'd reached the end of their own resources and had no choice but to place their faith in others. The moment of truth came when Dr. Maggie Sue approached Savannah with the IV line. Bo immediately positioned himself between them, but instead of the aggressive posturing they'd seen all day, he simply stood his ground and watched. When Jake placed a gentle hand on the bull's massive shoulder, speaking in the same soothing tones he'd used with Martha during her worst days, Bo took a single step backward, not retreating, but making space. "Sweet Jesus," Dr. Maggie Sue breathed. "He's giving me permission." The surgery began at 5:30 p.m., with the kind of controlled chaos that comes when medical professionals work under impossible conditions. Dr. Maggie Sue's hands moved with practiced efficiency, repairing internal damage while monitoring vital signs on equipment that had been hastily assembled around Savannah's unconscious form. But it was Bo who provided the most critical element, his presence at Savannah's head, his massive form serving as both comfort and guardian. Jake found himself remembering another surgical waiting room, another desperate vigil beside someone he loved. Martha's cancer surgery had taken 14 hours. 14 hours of pacing and praying and bargaining with whatever cosmic forces might be listening. The difference was that he'd been relegated to a sterile waiting area while strangers worked to save his wife's life. Here, Bo was allowed to be present for every moment, his devotion serving as part of the healing process rather than an obstacle to overcome. The first crisis came 20 minutes into the procedure. Savannah's blood pressure dropped precipitously, and alarms began beeping with the urgent rhythm that medical professionals learned to dread. "Doctor." Maggie Sue's voice remained calm, but Jake could see the fear in her eyes as she worked to stabilize her patient. "Come on, girl," she whispered. "Don't you give up on me now. You got too much to live for." Bo sensed the change immediately. His great head lifted, and he let out a sound unlike anything Jake had ever heard, not a bellow or a moo, but something that seemed to come from the deepest part of his soul. It was the sound of someone calling their beloved back from the edge of an abyss, a vocal lifeline thrown across the space between life and death, and impossibly, Savannah's vitals began to stabilize. The beeping alarms fell silent, replaced by the steady rhythm of a heart that had found its way back to beating. Dr. Maggie Sue looked up from her instruments with tears streaming down her face. "I've been a veterinarian for 25 years, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I have never seen anything like that. It's like he called her back." The crowd around the fence erupted in quiet celebration, the kind of restrained joy that comes when people witness something that transcends their understanding of how the world works. But Jake felt a chill of premonition, the same sensation he'd experienced during Martha's illness when temporary improvements had given way to devastating setbacks. The second crisis came 40 minutes later, and it was far worse than the first. Savannah went into shock, her body rejecting the trauma of surgery despite Dr. Maggie Sue's skillful work. The vital signs monitor flatlined with a sound that cut through the evening air like a death knell, and for a moment that stretched into eternity, everyone watching believed they were witnessing the end of more than just one animal's life. Beau's reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. He pressed his massive head against Savannah's neck, his entire body trembling with the effort of somehow willing her back to consciousness. The sound he made was beyond description, part grief, part rage, part desperate love, refusing to accept defeat. It was the sound Jake remembered making in his own throat when Martha's machines had fallen silent for those terrible seconds before the medical team restored her heartbeat. "Don't you dare," Dr. Maggie Sue said fiercely, her hands working with desperate efficiency to restart Savannah's heart. "Don't you dare leave him like this." The psychological horror of the moment wasn't just medical, it was existential. Jake watched Beau's devotion collide with the reality of mortality, saw the bull's world threatening to collapse around the loss of the one creature that made life worth living. It was every widow's nightmare, every grieving spouse's deepest fear made manifest in the form of a 2,000-pound animal whose heart was breaking in real time. But then, as the medical team worked with frantic urgency and Beau continued his vigil, something extraordinary happened. Savannah's eyes opened not fully conscious, but aware enough to see the massive form of her mate beside her. She managed the weakest possible sound, barely audible above the medical equipment, but unmistakably directed at Beau. The bull's transformation was immediate and profound. His trembling stopped, his breathing steadied, and his eyes filled with something that could only be described as renewed hope. He touched his muzzle to hers in a gesture so tender it made the watching crowd fall silent with reverence, and Savannah's vital signs stabilized once again. Jake felt his own breakdown beginning, not the medical crisis, but the emotional reckoning that comes when someone who's experienced profound loss watches others navigate the same treacherous waters. The parallels to Martha's illness were becoming overwhelming the desperate hope. The temporary victories followed by devastating setbacks. The way love could sometimes feel both powerful enough to move mountains and fragile enough to shatter at the slightest touch. "I can't do this," he whispered to Buck Thompson, his voice cracking under the weight of memories and current fears. "I can't watch them go through what Martha and I went through." Buck's weathered hand settled on Jake's shoulder with the steadying weight of someone who'd witnessed enough of life's cruelties and miracles to understand both. "Son, you ain't watching what you went through. You're watching what you would have wanted the chance to be there, to help, to make a difference when it mattered most." The words cut through Jake's emotional spiral with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. This wasn't Martha's story repeating itself. It was the story he would have written if he'd had the power to change the ending. Bo had been allowed to stay, to comfort, to participate in the fight for his mate's life. He wasn't relegated to waiting rooms and visiting hours. He was part of the healing process. As the surgery continued into the evening, with portable lights casting dramatic shadows across the makeshift medical facility, Jake began to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Not just successful veterinary medicine under impossible conditions, but a fundamental redefinition of what healing could look like when love was allowed to participate, rather than being pushed aside for the sake of sterile efficiency. The transport truck was due to arrive in less than 2 hours, but Jake no longer cared about deadlines or regulations or bureaucratic threats. Whatever happened next, they had already won something important. They had proven that love and devotion deserved a seat at the table when life and death decisions were being made. The war for Beauregard and Savannah's hearts had become something larger, a battle for the soul of compassion itself. The moment of truth, at 7:00 p.m., with only 30 minutes remaining before the transport deadline. The sound of diesel engines rumbling up the ranch drive cut through the evening air like thunder before a storm. Jake's heart sank as he watched not one but 3 large vehicles approach the livestock transport truck they'd been dreading, followed by a white van marked State Agricultural Emergency Response and a Sheriff's Department SUV with its emergency lights flashing ominously. The surgical tent, where Dr. Maggie Sue was still working to save Savannah's life, suddenly felt fragile and exposed, a bubble of hope surrounded by the machinery of bureaucratic inevitability. Bo, who had remained calm throughout the surgery, immediately sensed the change in atmosphere. His massive head lifted, nostrils flaring as he tested the air for threats, his body tensing with protective instincts that had been honed by 18 hours of desperate vigilance. "Stay calm, boy," Jake whispered, placing a steadying hand on the bull's shoulder. "Whatever happens, we're not giving up." The lead vehicle disgorged Morrison, the transport official, along with 2 men Jake didn't recognize, one wearing the uniform of a state veterinary inspector, the other dressed in the kind of cheap suit that screamed bureaucratic enforcement. Behind them came Deputy Clay Mitchell, his face grim with the expression of someone carrying out orders he didn't agree with. "Mr. Hawthorne," Morrison called out, his voice carrying the artificial authority of someone reading from a script. "By order of the Texas Department of Agriculture, these animals are to be immediately removed to separate facilities for treatment and evaluation. Any interference with this order constitutes obstruction of justice." Jed Hawthorne stepped forward, his 82-year-old frame somehow managing to project defiance despite the tremor in his hands. "Son, you're going to have to go through me to get to them bulls. And I got about 50 neighbors here who feel the same way." The crowd of supporters had indeed grown larger as word spread through the community. Ranch families, church members, local business owners, people who normally minded their own business had formed a human barrier around the surgical area. Their faces reflected the same determination Jake had seen during Martha's illness, when friends and family had rallied to support them through the darkest days. The state veterinary inspector, a thin man with the pallor of someone who spent more time reviewing paperwork than working with actual animals, approached the fence with obvious distaste for the rural setting. "This entire operation is a violation of emergency medical protocols. Surgery being performed in unsanitary conditions with unauthorized personnel present, on animals that should have been transferred to proper facilities hours ago." Dr. Maggie Sue looked up from her work, her surgical mask unable to hide the fury in her eyes. Unauthorized personnel. I've been licensed to practice veterinary medicine in this state for 25 years, and these unsanitary conditions have kept this animal alive while your proper facilities were busy shuffling paperwork. Doctor, you're endangering your medical license by participating in this circus, the inspector replied coldly. Step away from the animal and allow proper authorities to take control. The moment crystallized with the kind of clarity that comes when abstract principles collide with concrete reality. Jake found himself thinking about the promise he'd made to Eleanor Hawthorne in her hospital bed, about the vow he'd taken at Martha's bedside, about all the times in his life when doing the right thing had required standing up to people who confused authority with wisdom. No, he said quietly, stepping between the officials and the surgical tent. We're not stopping, and we're not separating them. Morrison's clipboard rattled as his hands shook with bureaucratic outrage. Ranger Harrison, you're interfering with a lawful order. I'm authorized to call for additional law enforcement if necessary. Then call them, Jake replied, his voice steady despite the racing of his heart. Call whoever you want. But you're not touching these animals until that surgery is finished. The standoff intensified as more vehicles arrived, news vans drawn by social media posts that had turned the ranch into an unlikely focal point for a national conversation about animal rights and bureaucratic overreach. Jake watched reporters setting up equipment and felt a moment of vertigo as he realized their small private battle had somehow become a public spectacle. But it was the arrival of the final vehicle that changed everything. A black sedan with government plates pulled up behind the official convoy, and out stepped a woman Jake recognized as Dr. Patricia Valdez, the state veterinarian whose reputation for both competence and compassion was legendary throughout Texas. Dr. Valdez surveyed the scene with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent 30 years making difficult decisions about animal welfare. She walked directly to the surgical tent, ignoring the protests of Morrison and the inspector, and spent several minutes observing Dr. Maggie Sue's work and Bo's continued vigil. Doctor, she said quietly to Dr. Maggie Sue, what's the patient's current status? Stable, but critical. Dr. Maggie Sue replied without looking up from her work. Internal bleeding stopped, but she's not out of danger. The next few hours are crucial. Dr. Valdez turned to examine Bo, her expression thoughtful as she took in the bull's obvious exhaustion and his unwavering determination to remain close to Savannah. And the male, how long has he been like this? 20 hours without food or water? Jake answered. He hasn't left her side since the attack. The devastating truth that Jake had been dreading came in the form of a manila folder that Morrison pulled from his briefcase with the satisfaction of someone playing a winning card. Dr. Valdez, you should know that the transport order has been amended due to the ongoing investigation and concerns about public safety. Both animals are scheduled for immediate euthanasia. The words hit the crowd like a physical blow. Jake felt his knees buckle as the full scope of the betrayal became clear. This had never been about separation. It had been about elimination. The pythons, the investigation, the bureaucratic delays, all of it had been a setup to justify destroying the evidence of Vernon Slade's crimes. Euthanasia, Dr. Maggie Sue's voice rose to a near shriek. These animals are victims, not threats. Savannah's going to make a full recovery, and Bo is the healthiest bull in East Texas. Morrison's expression remained coldly professional. The animals have been exposed to exotic diseases from the python attack. Protocol requires destruction to prevent potential contamination of other livestock. It was a lie, and everyone present knew it was a lie. But it was a lie backed by official documents and state authority. The kind of systematic deception that could destroy lives while hiding behind the language of public safety. Jed Hawthorne's face went white with shock and rage. "You bastards. You lying, cowardly bastards. This ain't about disease or safety. This is about covering up that snake-releasing son-of-a-bitch's crimes." The crowd's reaction was immediate and volcanic. 50 voices rose in protest. Families who'd driven miles to support the ranch, suddenly finding themselves witnesses to what amounted to judicial murder. Pastor Sam stepped forward, his usually gentle demeanor hardened by moral outrage. "This is an abomination," he declared, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades counseling people through their darkest hours. "These animals have shown us the meaning of true love, true devotion, and you want to kill them for it. What kind of evil masquerades as policy?" Dr. Valdez had remained silent throughout the confrontation, her face unreadable as she absorbed the full scope of the crisis. Finally, she spoke, her voice cutting through the chaos with quiet authority. "Mr. Morrison, show me the documentation supporting the euthanasia order." Morrison handed over the folder with obvious satisfaction. "But, Dr." Valdez's expression grew increasingly troubled as she read. After several minutes, she looked up with the kind of controlled anger that comes from discovering systematic corruption. "This order is falsified," she announced, her words falling into sudden silence. "The veterinary assessment cited here was never performed. The disease exposure protocols referenced don't exist. Someone has fabricated this entire justification." The revelation hit Morrison like a physical blow. His bureaucratic composure cracked, revealing something much uglier underneath. "Dr. Valdez, you're overstepping your authority. This operation is being conducted under emergency powers. Emergency powers that require my signature," Dr. Valdez interrupted, "which, as you can see, is not on any of these documents. Mr. Morrison, you and your associates are in violation of state law, federal animal welfare statutes, and basic human decency." Jake felt the world shift around him as hope blazed back to life. But it was Beau's reaction that broke his heart. The exhausted bull seemed to sense the change in atmosphere, the shift from despair to possibility. He lifted his great head and looked directly at Jake, and in those dark eyes was a plea that transcended species. "Don't let them take her. Don't let this be the end." As if summoned by some cosmic sense of timing, Savannah stirred on the surgical table. Her eyes opened, truly opened, and focused on Beau's face. The sound she made was weak but unmistakably affectionate. A greeting that said she recognized him, trusted him, loved him despite everything they'd endured. Beau's response was immediate and profound. He gently touched his muzzle to hers, and for the first time in 20 hours, his massive frame relaxed slightly, not enough to abandon his vigil, but enough to suggest that hope might finally be stronger than fear. The battle was far from over, but for the first time since the nightmare began, Jake believed they might actually win. Where love never gives up. 3 months later, the bronze plaque by the ranch gate caught the golden light of another Texas sunset, its simple words carrying the weight of everything they'd fought for, Heartland Ranch, where love never gives up. Below it, in smaller letters that Jake had insisted upon, the inscription read, "In memory of Eleanor Hawthorne, who taught us that love comes in all forms." Jake stood beside the pasture fence, watching Beauregard and Savannah graze together in the evening light. Beau still carried a slight limp from his ordeal. The stress and dehydration had taken their toll. But his eyes held the contentment of someone who'd fought for everything that mattered and won. Savannah had recovered completely, her coat gleaming with health, though she never wandered far from her devoted guardian. "You know," Jed said, approaching with 2 cups of coffee and the slow gait of a man who'd found peace after nearly losing everything. "Eleanor would have gotten a real kick out of how this all turned out. Ranch is busier now than it's been in 20 years. The viral story had indeed transformed Heartland Ranch into something unexpected, a destination for people seeking proof that love and loyalty still existed in a cynical world. Families drove hundreds of miles to witness the bond between Beau and Savannah, leaving donations that had not only saved the ranch, but turned it into a sanctuary for other bonded animal pairs. Dr. Maggie Sue emerged from the barn, her veterinary bag slung over her shoulder and a satisfied smile on her face. She'd become something of a celebrity in veterinary circles. The doctor who'd proved that including love in the healing process produced better outcomes than sterile efficiency. "How are our patients today?" Jake asked. "Thriving," she replied, watching as Beau gently nudged Savannah toward the sweet grass near the creek. "That bull hasn't left her side for more than a few minutes since the surgery. It's like he's still protecting her, even though the danger's long past." Buck Thompson joined them at the fence, his weathered face creased with satisfaction. 47 years working cattle, and I finally got to see something worth all the backache and early mornings. Love like that don't come along often. As the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Jake felt Martha's presence in the evening breeze. He'd learned something important from Beauregard and Savannah, that love wasn't about holding on so tightly it hurt, but about showing up every day with the quiet determination to protect what mattered most. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "the greatest love stories aren't about finding each other. They're about refusing to let go." In the pasture, 2 hearts that had weathered every storm continued their eternal dance, proving that some bonds are stronger than fear, deeper than pain, and more enduring than time itself. Dear friends, if you're watching this story unfold and feeling that familiar tightness in your chest, you're not alone. At our age, we've all loved deeply and lost greatly. We've stood beside hospital beds, held hands through final moments, and wondered if devotion still means anything in this fast-paced world. Beauregard and Savannah remind us that it does. Their story isn't just about 2 cattle, it's about every one of us who refused to give up when love was tested by life's cruelest storms. Like Jake watching over Martha, like Jed honoring Eleanor's memory. We've all made that choice to stay when leaving would be easier. We've all been that devoted soul standing guard over what matters most. In a time when commitment seems old-fashioned and loyalty feels rare, these 2 hearts prove that real love doesn't quit when the going gets tough. It shows up every day, weathering every storm, refusing to let bureaucrats or cynics diminish what the heart knows is sacred. As Pastor Sam reminded us, love is love, whether it's got 2 legs or 4. Today, Let's celebrate the beautiful truth that devotion never goes out of style. What moment in your own life reminded you that true love means never giving up? Have you ever witnessed a bond so strong it changed how you see the world? Share your story in the comments below. We'd love to hear how love has shaped your journey.